Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the Dribble Drive. Austin Render with you here. We'll get to our guest who you see on the screen here shortly. This is episode 3 of the Dribble Drive. I want to start by thanking all of those who have been a part of our Dribble Drive podcast so far, whether you've streamed it on YouTube, watched it live with us on X or YouTube. Maybe you've listened to the podcast before, maybe that's how you're taking it in right now. We appreciate the support that we've gotten here in the first couple of releases. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcasts, the Back Home Network YouTube page. We're live every Monday night at 7 o'clock on YouTube and my personal X page at Austin Render. So make sure you come out. Make sure you subscribe as well. We love to have subscribers. That helps us, lets us know that you guys are enjoying the show. So we do appreciate that. One thing I want to start each episode with is kind of some news that's going on around in the Big Ten. So we'll start there first, and let's talk about what's going on with the U18 AmeriCup team, which is head by head coach Terry Morin. Of course, Indiana's head coach down in Columbia. They won gold. A couple of USC incoming freshmen on that team, Kennedy Smith and Kaylee Heckle. So congratulations to them. We'll see some of those players coming up in the Big Ten this season. Maryland is currently on an overseas summer trip to Croatia. So a very cool experience there for Maryland. Oregon is redoing its court design. As we all have seen the trees on that court. Now they're coming to the Big Ten. They're going to have a new court design. So excited to see that one. We'll actually be out there. I'll be out there with Indiana later this season to see that new court. And then a new one just earlier this week, Tay Valladay has been announced as the Director of Player Development at Penn State. She, of course, just finished her final season with the Nittany Lions as a grad transfer. So she has continued to don the navy and white out there in Happy Valley. So that's kind of your Big Ten news on this episode 3. So with that, let's bring in our guest. He is the play-by-play voice of the Michigan State Spartans, Dalton Shetler. Dalton, thanks so much for joining us, man. We appreciate you spending some time with us in the middle of your, I would imagine, your off time here in the summer, just kicking back and relaxing. But welcome to the show, Dalton.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Austin. Once I heard this podcast was going to be launched, I was really excited about it. I think this fills a pretty void, empty space in podcasting, and I'm always excited to talk Big Ten hoops. Thanks for having me.
I have felt like after each episode I've recorded so far, I'm just fired up for the season. As soon as I'm done, as soon as I hit that end record button, I'm like, is it October yet? Like, man, I'm ready. But the first 2 episodes have kind of been a general look around the Big Ten, trying to hop around between teams. One of the things I wanted to do as we kind of go through these summer months, we get ready for the season, is start to kind of pick at individual teams. And so we're starting with the Michigan State Spartans here in this 1st of July episode. And Dalton, as we look at Michigan State, your squad had a really, really fun year last year. First-year head coach Robyn Fralick comes over from Bowling Green, gets you guys into the NCAA tournament, a top 4 seed in the Big Ten. Let's start back in like September, October, before the season, when you know you've got a new head coach in Robyn Fralick. What were the expectations for this Michigan State team? Because it does kind of feel like maybe they exceeded them.
Oh, I think that's absolutely fair to say. And I do want to say you nailed it on the head when you said fun. I mean, that's the word we talk about a lot with what this season was. And honestly, between growing up playing sports, between some of the broadcasting teams I've been around, this might have been the most fun season by a sports team that I've ever gotten to experience in my entire life. It was that much of a fun ride for the following reasons. And we'll start with the expectations. You're right. You bring in a first-year head coach in Robyn Fralick, and let's take a look at what the team was at that point. You're coming off of a year where you finished 8th or 9th in the Big Ten in the 2022-2023 season. You lost Kamari McDaniel, who was your leading scorer. Matilda Eck, your sharpshooter, who's so promising, transferred out to Virginia Tech. Tyre Parks, who was your leading post player, transferred to Ohio State. So not only are you starting with a new head coach, but you are trying to assemble something from a lot of loss of production from what you already knew. So I would say heading into the year, I think the consensus from talking with other media members was the expectations Michigan State would probably be 9th or 10th in the Big Ten heading into that year. And then as you started to go, one thing we knew was going to be a problem for Michigan State was the size. There was not a lot of size on this Michigan State squad. And then before you get to Thanksgiving, Isa Alexander goes down with an injury, and she's done for the season. In that same week, Gabby Elliott goes down with a torn ACL, done for the year, and she was one of your leading rebounders at the time. Before you get to Christmas, you lose your 6'5" freshman center, Mary Mang. So this was already such a small roster in both height and depth. And it turned out to be, okay, we have a 7-player rotation before Christmas. We have 2 players that are 6 feet tall or taller. Let's see what we can do. And what they ended up doing was going to the NCAA tournament for the first time in 5 years. They won 20 games. They won 22 games to be even more specific. It was the first time they won 20 games in 5 years. They broke school records for most points per game at about 83 points per game. And they made 283 threes, which is the most ever by a Michigan State women's basketball team. So when you set up that conjuncture of it was already a small team, there were so many question marks heading into it. And then for them to launch the way they did through the Big Ten, winning 10 games, it was unbelievable.
It really was so much fun to watch as the season went on. It became more and more real. Like, okay, this team's not going anywhere. And the Michigan State IU game was the one game I missed last year. We had a family event, an emergency I had to go down to. But that was such a fun basketball game. And I know I'm a little biased because the Hoosiers did come out on top. But,
it was a fun game.
That game was unbelievable, back and forth. Neither team could get a stop, it felt like, for the longest time. But you mentioned that the points per game, the offense under Robyn Fralick just exploded. What was the key to the offensive success? Does it really kind of start with Julia Ayrault and what she was able to do?
Well, Julia Ayrault deserves a lot of credit, and I think we'll get into a little bit of her play and her growth in a minute, because you want to talk about one of the great Big Ten stories that I don't think enough people know about. Julia Ayrault is that. But I would say Robyn Fralick forever, throughout her entire coaching career, whether it was at Bowling Green or whether she was at Ashland, where she was the head coach, national champion coach. She went 104-3, by the way, when she was the head coach at Ashland. But my point is, part of the blueprint's always been to play fast for Robyn Fralick. And that was no different, especially given the fact of how small this Michigan State team was. There was no doubt about it. They wanted to get out and play. So one of the big things when you talk about Michigan State this past year, and we mentioned the 83 points per game, I would say if you're looking for the starting point, Austin, it starts with defense. Michigan State applied so much full court pressure throughout this year, picking up all 94 feet, a bit of a run and jump kind of style, pressing, getting after. The goal was to create some chaos and then go down on the other end and turn it into some easy baskets. I mean, this was a group that got out and ran consistently. And one of the first practices before the season started, I remember going there and just watching, and Robyn came over and said, well, what do you think right now? And I was like, they're fast. Like, there's a real emphasis on pace of play. And I think that's something that gets talked about a lot, is teams want to play fast, but teams don't always execute that at such a high level, just because it's a lot of work and it takes a lot to be able to run that way. But Robyn Fralick likes to run that way. And with some of the additions that the squad has too, there's going to be a bigger emphasis on that full court pressure, and for that defense to turn into some easy offense and get some points up on the board.
They were a fast team. They shot the ball well. There were a lot of great things that happened within that offense. And we mentioned Julia Ayrault. She takes a huge jump. And she's one of the many reasons that, and I've said this on each episode so far, that I started this podcast, because as good as Caitlin Clark was, a lot of the attention went her way, and rightfully so. But it didn't allow other stories, other players to develop in the conference maybe as deeply as others would like. I think about somebody like J.C. Sheldon. I used this example last week, a top 5 pick in the WNBA draft that nobody talked about on the championship team in the Big Ten. Julia Ayrault's another example of that. One of the most improved players, maybe the most improved player in the conference last season. What did you see anything that maybe kind of led you to think there's a breakout year coming for her, or was this kind of out of left field even from you watching some preseason stuff?
So I would say, and for context too, for listeners, Julia Ayrault the year before had averaged, I want to say 3 points a game, had grabbed a couple rebounds a game, had a smaller role on that 2022-2023 Michigan State squad, and she also had been overcoming injuries. She dealt with several injuries early on in her career, but it was kind of trying to figure out what the right lane was for her. And to go back, again, we talk about with Isa Alexander, Mary Mang, both having those early season injuries that ended their year. It became pretty evident with such a small roster with 7 players, and Julia Ayrault's the tallest out of the 7 that Michigan State had left, and she stands at 6'2". Like, look, you're now the center, and we've got to play with that and figure it out, because traditionally she's a guard at 6'2". She's athletic, puts the ball on the floor. But what that ended up creating, Austin, as Robyn Fralick has told me a couple of times, Julia Ayrault found her position by being forced out of her position and now becoming that stretch 5 where she averaged this past year over 15 points a game, 7.5 rebounds a game. Look at some of the things she accomplished. Not only that, but she also had 65 blocks this past year. That's the 5th most ever in a Spartan season. She's now 4th all time in MSU history with 136 career blocks. She scored 477 points on the season. But again, a lot of it is just a credit to how versatile Julia Ayrault is. This Michigan State team got into the half court when they weren't able to score in transition right away. And it was about finding Julia Ayrault the ball in the high post and playing from there. And they used what was an apparent size mismatch with her only being 6'2", going against the Mackenzie Holmeses of the world and so many of the great forwards that exist in the Big Ten. And it was all about, okay, well, let's bring them away from the basket. If Julia likes the matchup, she'll take them off the dribble because she's quicker and more athletic. And then she always is able to make the right play out of that too. And so putting her in the high post, I think it's a lot like in football, to use an analogy, the tight end, like how Rob Gronkowski started to open up all these different dimensions for the Patriots, because it's like, oh, this guy doesn't just block, he doesn't just catch. This guy can be the core of your offense because it's such a mismatch for other teams to go against. That's what Julia Ayrault became. And again, it all kind of happened out of these weird circumstances with all these injuries early on. She was forced to play the 5, and she dominated it in a unique way, and it unlocked everything, really, for Michigan State offensively.
Yeah, I mean, I would imagine she wasn't expected to be the 5 at the beginning of the year, correct?
No. She mainly, I would say, play mostly 4 and maybe spare a little bit, a couple of different roles. But look, positionless basketball is kind of a thing with Robyn too. I mean, she wants to play fast. She wants 5 players who can dribble and pass and do things. So, I mean, maybe a little bit, but certainly not to be the 5.
Yeah. Well, if you want to see an example of that kind of everybody can drive, everybody can shoot offense, go watch the film of the IU Michigan State game, because the Spartan offense put on a clinic and kind of exposed the Hoosiers a little bit on their straight line drive defense. And that was kind of a wake-up call for Indiana moving forward in the season, because they really struggled, and that mismatch that Julia puts on defenders was on display in that game. She gives up a little bit of size defensively, but that speed and athleticism on the offensive side certainly makes up for that. You bring back some other players as well. Halleck, kind of the other standout that was up there for 6th player of the year in the Big Ten Conference. When you look at what's returning in 24-25, I would imagine you guys still have to be pretty excited about even just that pair coming back and giving you another year.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Theron Halleck, as she became known on the team as the spark plug. Her and Tori Osmond coming off the bench, Theron with a T, Tori with a T. Robyn called them TNT Dynamite coming off the bench. And what they did this year, when you look at bench points per game, Michigan State scored about 26 points off the bench per game. That was best in the Big Ten Conference. So Theron Halleck wins 6th player of the year because really all that production came from just those 2 players. Like I said, this was a legitimate 7-player rotation that Michigan State just rocked with throughout the course of the season. So Theron gives you a lot of energy, a lot of grit, a lot of hustle. There is nothing that is below Theron. Theron is one of those players that will roll her sleeve up and do whatever is asked and just flat out cares to win. I mean, she's just a winner through and through in her DNA. So you bring her back. That's a big plus. Abby Kimball returns. Of course, she was the starting 2 guard for Michigan State all season long, averaged about 10 points a game, 9 points a game. Really good 3-point shooter. I think a big thing over this offseason is getting more shot creations from Abby Kimball. So it's not so much just spot up, find her, and she drills it, where she's able to create a little bit. But from there, you get Isa Alexander, you get Mary Ming back from those injuries as well. And then Jocelyn Tate returns, who, as Robyn Fralick says, again, Jocelyn Tate transferred from Bowling Green to Michigan State with Robyn when she made that move. And Robyn says that, look, the staff has all these different analytics and formulas they have to kind of compute significance and impact on winning. Jocelyn Tate ranks at the top. What she does defensively that people don't understand helps this team out in a pretty big way. So you start with those players, and then Kenny Blair comes back, and then you get into the additions, which there's a lot of reason to be excited about those additions too.
Yeah, we'll talk about those in a second, but the core that's coming back, especially those who got the playing time in the NCAA tournament, how much, I know it was just a one and done situation, but how much does getting thrown into that fire for a lot of these players for the first time not only ignite the flame of wanting to get back, but when they do get back, now they've got that experience?
I think it's big. I think it's really big because, I mean, kind of to your point, these players had not experienced that. I mean, the last time Michigan State had made the tournament was the, I believe, 1920 season. It was 3 years prior. And you're right. It was a tough loss to North Carolina. Michigan State simply just got beat on the boards. And it didn't really matter what they did in other ways to try and make up for it. I mean, they just put themselves too far in a hole to overcome that. But I think that experience is huge. And I think one thing Robyn talks about a lot, and look, if you folks have not listened to Robyn Fralick talk, this is a quote machine. One of her assistant coaches, Maria Kaza, keeps a little notebook of Fralickisms, as she calls it, with all these different quotes that Robyn Fralick has, not just about basketball, but life as well. She's got so many great things that she loves to pour in with wisdom, but she always said this past year, she didn't believe in putting a limit on this team. Never believes on putting limits on anybody. So when they ask for expectations, what's your goal? Well, it's not going to be a number, because that's limiting yourself to whatever that number is. And she believes, when going back to the Julia Ayrault point, that's a big reason why Julia turned things around too. She quit putting a limit on herself, was one of Robyn's takeaways. She got confidence and she became first team all Big Ten. But to that point, now that they've reached that and they know they can do that, it changes things a bit mentally. And especially with a staff and a group, a program, kind of like how Robyn's leading this, where everything is so visualized and so spiritual sounds like a strong word, but it's kind of true. There's a real belief and a buy-in. And now that you have that taste, that sample, you can only imagine what kind of sows from there.
Yeah, I would imagine that this is a team that's set up for success because of what they got to experience in year one. Not only did they get to experience, they went down to Columbia, South Carolina, the obviously eventual national champs, didn't play them, but kind of felt the aura of being in that situation. So I'm excited to see what they have. And Robyn Fralick, to me, adds to what I believe is a growing, really good head coaching group in this conference.
100%.
And the conference has made a couple of great hires here in the last year or two. Shauna Green coming over into Illinois and turning that team around. Obviously, Robyn Fralick, Dawn Plitzowitz from Minnesota. I thought she was a wonderful hire. And if Mara Braun doesn't get hurt, that might have been a tournament team as well. Yeah. So there's just some really good coaches. And we're obviously adding a ton of good coaches from the West Coast coming in to the conference this season. So it just feels like a really well-coached conference. All right, let's talk transfer portal. It's obviously a big thing in 2024. You can't go through an offseason without some departures and some arrivals. For Michigan State, they bring in Grace Van Sluten, which I'm extremely jealous of you because there's a wonderful nickname there that you're nodding your head, so I know you're going to use
Van Shooten. It's happening already.
I almost tweeted at you when I saw the commitment. I was like, "Oh, Dalton, you've got a slam dunk with Grace Van Sluten there."
Us radio guys, we all think alike, huh?
We're looking for these opportunities. You got Jaden Simmons coming in from Arizona State, Nyla Hampton from Ball State, Emma Shoemate from Ohio State. You do lose a couple in Dee Hageman and Gabby Elliott to actually Elliott at least an in-conference transfer, which seems to be happening more and more often now, which is always surprising to me. But when you assess obviously Dee is the big one that leaves the point guard hole, but you bring in so much talent there from other schools. How do you feel like Michigan State netted out in the transfer portal?
Well, I think they netted extremely positive because they got a lot of the pieces they want to fit this all together. And you talk about some of the departures. I mean, this isn't a portal departure, but losing Mo Joyner this upcoming season for Michigan State is a big, big blow. Of course, she graduated this past year, but she was one of the captains of the squad. Her and Julia Ayrault were. Mo averaged over 15 points a game, but maybe more than that, she was the best perimeter defender, I think you could say, for Michigan State this past year. Look, everybody remembers the buzzer beater Caitlin Clark hit in that 76-73 win over Michigan State at right around New Year's. I think it was January 2nd. She hit that over the top of Mo Joyner for that win, but it was her 40th point, but it took 34 shots for Caitlin Clark to score the 40, and it's because Mo Joyner was on her all night. Now, not that you necessarily just blink at 40 points, but it goes to show what Mo was doing for you defensively on the perimeter. So Michigan State's got to find a way to fill some of that gap with that wing player, Mo Joyner, being gone. And when you take a look at some of these pieces, you imagine they'll be able to do that. And let's go back to that fast break or the full court pressure, rather, on the other side that we were talking about. Look, last year, Michigan State in turnover margin ranked 8th in the country. They were plus 6.5. When you look at turnovers forced per game, they averaged anywhere from 18 to 19 turnovers a game and only had 11 themselves. Assist to turnover ratio, they were second best in the nation at 1.6. My point being, they love to turn teams over. And when you throw in Nyla Hampton here, who's somebody who also has played for Robyn Fralick before, she started at Bowling Green and this past year transferred to Ball State and now is coming back to play for Robyn at Michigan State. She's a 2-time MAC Defensive Player of the Year. She's going to be able to help get after it. Jaden Simmons from Arizona State, you mentioned, she's somebody who's going to be able to be kind of the head of the snake of that offense a bit too, whether it's facilitating dishing, using that speed, able to create some steals. And we talk about that wing presence that's now gone from Mo Joyner. Emma Shoemate can help there too. 6'1", long, athletic, had a hard time carving out a role at Ohio State, but you're talking about somebody who can shoot 40% from three. And if you're able to get her comfortable in a role and confident, who knows what that can be for Michigan State. And last, but certainly not least, Grace Van Sluten. This pairing of Van Sluten and Ayrault together on the floor is really fascinating to me because you have two players, Ayrault 6'2", Van Sluten 6'3", who both can play out of the high post. They both can pass it well. They both average 15 points a game. They can shoot the three. They can play inside. You have two real versatile pieces there, Swiss Army knives. And them playing together is going to be really interesting because it's going to cause a lot of defenses to have to come up with some answers that are going to be pretty hard to come up with. I mean, those two together is really going to be a fun tandem to watch, maybe one of the most fun in the Big Ten.
I totally agree with you. When Grace Van Sluten committed, I was like, "Whoa, that's a really good get," and very intriguing because of the way that you feel like she and Ayrault play similarly. Mm-hmm. And sometimes you think if they play too similarly, they won't work together. But I think those two could just be two peas in a pod there and just ready to go coming up this season. I guess that's technically an in-conference transfer because she comes over from
Oregon,
the newly Big Ten minted Oregon Ducks. But doesn't really feel like it, but does transfer over from a now current Big Ten school. But you mentioned Emma Shoemate as well. I think you're right. I mean, we didn't get to see much of her at Ohio State, but it's hard to play at Ohio State. That's a championship level team there. She's got a lot of talent in there for sure. No doubt about that. It's going to be a very new-looking Big Ten across the conference. A lot of transfers, a lot of graduations, certainly A lot of new faces in new places for sure. Competitiveness in the Big Ten. I mean, you add USC and UCLA, who are probably preseason 1 and 2 in the Big Ten, probably both preseason top 10 nationally, maybe even top 5. Oregon and Washington, down years, but certainly have programs that can build their way back up into success. So you're certainly at least adding 2 into the top 4 or 5 in the Big Ten. So now teams like Indiana, Michigan State, Nebraska, they got to fight to kind of be in that top 5 or 6 because it feels like, well, there's 2 of the spots right there. I'm really excited about it. I'm sure you are too, just the competitiveness of this conference moving forward.
Oh, it's going to be cutthroat. I mean, the Big Ten's coming off of a pair of years where it's been, if not the peak, right around the peak of what the entirety of its history in Big Ten women's basketball at its best level. When you consider the deep runs that have been made by some of these Big Ten teams, obviously the phenomena that Caitlin Clark was, but some of the stellar play we've seen these last couple of years. And then you throw in, as you said, I mean, USC and UCLA are right at the top as you begin with this. So I think one of the things that's really interesting about what we're going to see is we have to, and I believe this really across all sports, like I believe this with men's basketball, I believe this with football, we have to be pretty thorough in thinking, and maybe even nuanced in thinking of how we evaluate what we're seeing out of these teams, because you can finish 5th in the Big Ten, and that can be a hell of an accomplishment for some programs. Like, it's just because of how top heavy this is. When you talk about Ohio State too, what they continue to bring back, Cody McMahon's still there in Columbus, and they've piled on some big additions too. I mean, those 3 teams of USC, UCLA, and Ohio State, they're top 5, at least top 10 nationally. Like they're going to be up there hanging around. So I think that's one of the big things. And to the other point, I love how the schedule works now. You have 18 games for the Big Ten, and now with 18 teams, you're going to play everybody once, and one team you'll play twice. I think that lays out pretty nice. I think overall it's going to really help this conference. I just think we have to be smart in how we evaluate and judge what we're seeing or grade teams and performances, because it's going to be a lot harder.
Yeah, there's been 7 Big Ten teams in the tournament 2 straight years. If you finish 7th or 8th this coming year in the Big Ten, you're probably a tournament team, and you're a dangerous team. You're certainly a weathered team through the toughness of this conference coming up this season. I would imagine Michigan State's 2 play is Michigan. Am I correct in saying that?
That is correct.
Okay, so that'll be your 2 play. Do you guys go to LA or the Northwest?
We go to LA, so USC and UCLA. And that's the other thing too. Check out the road games Michigan State gets here, because I think some of this will be dependent on this too. For road games for Michigan State this upcoming year, they're at Illinois. And Illinois is going to be pretty good, you imagine, this year.
That's no bargain trip there.
At Maryland.
Oh, man.
At Nebraska. At Northwestern. At Ohio State. At Rutgers. At UCLA. At USC. So in these one times, how they split, I mean, Michigan State kind of got a short straw in the home road splits. Like, we're talking about some of the very best, not just, again, in the conference, but those ones in the country, Ohio State, USC, UCLA, all of them are going to be on the road. So Michigan State has its work cut out for them for this upcoming season. Obviously, we're still spitballing here at the beginning of July, so it's nothing you necessarily panic over, but it's something to keep in mind too. It's a challenging way that their schedule split as of now.
Yeah, I said it last episode. The people who get to host the LA schools this year have a slight advantage.
Yeah.
Because that is helpful. Those are probably the 2 best teams in the conference. And if you drew the Northwest trip, and that's not trying to make a slight against Oregon and Washington, I don't think that'll be an easy trip either. But to not have to play 2 top 5, 10 teams, and I would imagine the span of a long weekend, is a huge break to have them come to you, which the Hoosiers were fortunate enough to get. But I'll also be interested, and I've said this each episode, what the schedule is going to look like for the West Coast teams. How long do they go east? Do they play 2 games at a time? Do they have a week where they play 3 games out east and then go home? Could you get UCLA on the 2nd or 3rd game of a East Coast swing? I'll be very curious to see how all of that kind of works out. But I think that the thing that I'm getting from everybody is that we're excited about this season. It's going to be an absolute blast. Dalton, I want to finish with this. I want to try and do this with everybody we have on here, at least those of us who get to travel around a lot. What I'm sure you're biased, and we all are, to our home, our comfort, our broadcast booth, and our home venue. But when you go on the road, where's your favorite place to broadcast from?
Ooh, okay. So we'll completely take home out of this. So Michigan State's out of the picture. Favorite venue to go to in the Big Ten is how I'll frame it, and this one might stab you a little bit in the ribs. It's Mackey Arena, West Lafayette. Before, for listeners too who may not be aware, so I just completed my second year with the Michigan State women's team. I'll be heading to year 3, but the 6 years prior, I was the host for Michigan State men's basketball. So I did pregame, halftime, traveled around, and I still remember what Mackey is like for some of those games and some of those matchups. And there was just nothing like it. The way the sound reverberates in that building, it still gives you kind of that aura and chills when you walk in, as does Assembly Hall in Bloomington. Like, I think that would be my second favorite, is going to Bloomington, just because you get that feeling. I mean, look, I'm also from Indiana, just like yourself, Austin. We're both from the Fort Wayne area. We grew up with Hoosier hysteria. We grew up with all of that stuff. But you feel it when you walk in those two places in a different way than I think maybe you do some other places. I'll say my favorite town to visit, Bloomington's actually up there, but my favorite is Madison, Wisconsin. That's my favorite town to go to.
I want to go to Madison when it's not. We always go when there's snow on the ground. So I'd like to go when it's not. I wish they had a baseball team so we could go up there in April or May and kind of, because that place I've heard is wonderful in the summer. It's a great place to visit. Unfortunately, it's been ice cold every time that we have gone to Madison, Wisconsin. I'm like Dalton. This will be my 4th year, so I'm still traveling around. But you won't stab me on this podcast with Mackey and Purdue references, because the IU stuff is gone. I host this as a Big Ten women's basketball fan.
That works.
I do enjoy my trips to Mackey Arena. I really do, and they're always packed for when the Hoosiers come to town. So that's a really, really good place to play. And he answered my other question, which was the best town, and Madison, a good answer to that one as well. Well, Dalton, we really appreciate you fitting us into your busy summer schedule, and I'm excited. Do we come to you guys this year? I don't remember Yes,
you do.
Bloomington on that. Yep. So we'll be up in East Lansing this year, which will be fun. We didn't get up there this past season, so we'll certainly be seeing you then, and we'll be talking to you a lot between now and then. But Dalton, thanks so much for stopping by.
Absolutely. Glad to be here. Anytime you need me, Austin. Take care.
Well, we appreciate it. A fun episode focusing in on the Michigan State Spartans. Remember to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel as well as Spotify. Give us a rating. Let us know how we're doing. And tweet at us. Let us know your thoughts on the show. Austin Render on X. Thanks so much for spending another episode with us. Another fun one coming up next week. For Dalton Shetler, I'm Austin Render, saying so long from the Dribble Drive podcast.